This is your Wednesday Strip Sports Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. We got a lot to get to today. Exciting show. Talk in a little bit with Chris Hine, who covers the Timberwolves for the Star Tribune. But first, a little something I call "What Did I Miss?" And you missed a lot if you went to bed, kind of at a regular time last night. You woke up probably to some good news. Nelson Cruz back with the Twins on a 1-year, $13 million contract. Kind of a no-brainer on both sides, I think. They were kind of waiting it out. But great news for the Twins. This is a guy who, had their only 2 runs batted in the postseason against Houston last year. Has had 2 incredible seasons, one of them obviously shorter than the other because of the COVID-shortened season last year. He will turn 41 in July, but the risk is minimal. As they like to say in the business, there is no such thing as a bad 1-year contract. This one worth $13 million, about what he was making for those first 2 years. And, even though he does turn 41, Baseball Reference still thinks he's going to have a pretty good year. 34 homers, 89 RBIs, and OPS up close to 900. So good news for the Twins. Another big bat, the boomstick, back in the middle of that lineup. Wild loses again. Maybe more importantly, loses another player for a while. 2-1 loss to Colorado. Jared Spurgeon with the dreaded upper body injury. He's going to test that depth that Sarah McClellan and I talked about on Tuesday's podcast even more if he can't play Thursday and beyond. They're already missing Matt Dumba, Marcus Foligno in the COVID protocols, Marcus Johansson. They do get Kevin Fiala back on Thursday, and we'll have more on that a little bit later in the show too, as I welcome in a very special guest, Chiken Fingerz, to talk about that suspension and how angry Chiken Fingerz is about that suspension to Fiala. But a depth test for sure for the Wild if Spurgeon is out for any length of time. Last thing I want to get to, and all of these are stories you can find on StarTribune.com and in the print product of the Star Tribune. Kayla McBride introduced officially as a new member of the Minnesota Lynx. Want to play a quote from her right now just to kind of show what she's thinking and why she decided to join the Lynx.
Regardless of what anybody says in this rebuild or whatever, Sylvia Fowles on that team, Nafisa Collier, Crystal Dangerfield was Rookie of the Year. Dantas, there's so much talent on this team already. They were in the semis last year, just like us, fighting for their lives. And I think that in this league, that counts for so much more than just, wins and losses. It's how you show up every day and how you compete every day. And that doesn't go unnoticed. And I think that as a competitor myself, that it was kind of a no-brainer to want to be a part of something like that.
She should be part of a really exciting team this year. I hope everybody gets a chance to see that because I believe that will be the team that has a best chance to win another championship here in Minnesota in the near future.
I'm Nyla Jean Myers, Senior Assistant Sports Editor at the Star Tribune. Thank you for listening to Strip Sports Daily Delivery. This work is made possible by our Star Tribune subscribers. For unlimited access to the articles mentioned in this podcast and our coverage of Minnesota sports from pros to preps, go to startribune.com/subscribe.
All right, I am joined now by Chris Hine, who covers the Timberwolves for the Star Tribune. Up until about a week ago, I was our Timberwolves editor, but now I am devoting myself fully to this podcast and other writing duties. So I don't get to see Chris as much, so I'm excited to see him today. Chris, how are you doing?
I'm good, Mike. I have to say, probably of all the listeners to this podcast, I probably have the most love-hate relationship already with this podcast because it took you away from being the Timberwolves editor.
Well,
so I already kind of hate this podcast.
Oh
so
man,
I'm sorry to say it.
I think a lot of people are already hate listening to the podcast. So you join the club, get in line, yep. Chris Hine. Glad to have you on. We'll talk still a lot. I'm going to have you on regularly to talk about the Wolves because I can't stay away from them, even though they're 5-15. You've been on the beat for a few years now. Our history together on this beat goes back to about 3 days before Jimmy Butler demanded a trade, which was a lot of fun. Here we are, fast forward, 2.5 years. And like I said, this team is 5-15. Today, I want to spend a little time. I don't want to sugarcoat things, but I do want to maybe probe a little bit for some reasons for optimism while also acknowledging what has gone wrong in these 20 games. So let's start with probably the most interesting player on this roster, Anthony Edwards, 19-year-old rookie, number 1 overall pick. Some of the other rookies in his class are putting up some pretty good numbers, but he's starting to kind of come along for the ride now too. What if you're a Wolves fan and you're evaluating where Anthony Edwards is after 20 games and what his future might be? What are some things you would be pointing to as things you like?
Yeah, I think that evaluation has really changed in tone over the last week or so. I think starting with might have been game number 2 against Golden State when they played that little series out there through now. He's looked like a different player on the floor. He's looked more in command of the game when he's on the floor. He's making better decisions, I think, whether it be to shoot, not to shoot, better decisions around the rim, finishing better at the rim. He's been shooting threes better over the last week. It's all been pointing towards a good direction for Edwards. And, surprise, NBA rookies sometimes struggle, their progress might not be a straight arrow upward. It might be bad nights here, good nights here, slow start, and then comes on as the season goes along, especially in an abnormal season when you don't have a summer league or a training camp to work out some issues. So I think of everything that's happened with the Timberwolves over the last week, Edwards is the biggest reason for optimism, because I think you could see what he looks like in the future and what maybe the team looks like around him, and just the way he's able to, at 19 years old, take over a game in stretches.
What do you attribute primarily to this, better stretch for him for sure? Do you think he's figuring it out? Have they figured out ways to make the game easier for them? What are you seeing in that regard?
We asked him that the other night, and he just said, and it's kind of a cliched answer that you hear a lot from young players, but he just said the game is starting to slow down for him. And it's true, and that only comes with reps and actually playing games and getting out there. It's hard to simulate that in a practice. Just what is actually asked of you in an NBA game. And so now he's had 20 games under his belt. That's a significant amount of time, knock on wood, he's been healthy. So he's been available for those games. So yeah, with reps comes improvement. And I think that's what we're seeing right now early in the season is he's getting used to it. His mind is processing the game, and that's translating to quicker decisions, especially as it relates to distributing the ball. He's learning the offense. You could see, I think, the other night when they played Cleveland at Target Center, you could see him properly spacing the offense and getting open for threes. I think it's all starting to come together for him through the first quarter of the season here.
I really like him when he's in attack mode, when they let him kind of handle the ball at the top and kind of play make and create. I feel like that's a part of his game I didn't quite realize was this far along. You think of him as a shooting guard who had 1 year in college, and obviously there's the unfortunate, Andrew Wiggins comparisons where, Wolves fans had watched Wiggins play for 6 years. Wiggins certainly, at least early in his career, didn't really have much of a handle. Edwards has a handle. He can distribute, he can make passes, and he can get himself not just a 17-footer, but he can get himself to the basket and make life hard on defenses.
Yeah, 100%. His ball handling ability is NBA ready. The biggest thing with him when it comes to going to the basket was his ability to finish at the rim, and he either wasn't getting calls, as he famously complained a few weeks ago, or he was just missing. But now he's not missing as much, and he's maybe getting a couple other calls. So I think some of those issues are progressing to the mean as time goes on here. I hate when people say regressing to the mean when they mean it to go in a positive direction. It's not regressing if it's going in a positive direction.
Are those
anyway?
Those
end
are
of
allowed.
My little rant.
Those are allowed. It's allowed to do that. I didn't know it was allowed to do that.
Yes, yeah. Things are allowed to go in a positive direction. No, it's been impressive, his ball handling ability though, and I think was that spin move. I don't know if it was Okoro or Garland that was guarding him the other night, but that one spin move he had was just highlight worthy. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and he's not the only one. I mean, he's the one that most of the eyes are on right now, obviously, as the number one overall pick. But I think if you're also hunting for some signs of optimism, some of their other young players, including number 28 overall pick Jaden McDaniels, and a guy like Jared Vanderbilt's got extended run, Naz Reid's got an extended run, even Jalen Noel seeing more minutes lately. These guys they've been hit or miss. Everybody's going to be hit or miss, but you can see some skill sets emerging in each of those guys. That make you think, okay, keep progressing. You could see them being regular rotation contributors, I would say.
Yeah. And that's where I think this week in Timberwolves misery feels a little different than previous weeks in Timberwolves misery, because I think over the last week you could see some of the progression with those guys, especially with the last few games. Jaden McDaniels has been the defensive standout. And what do they need? They need defending at the 4 position. And here comes a 20-year-old rookie that's giving it to them right now. So I think that's been helpful. Jared Vanderbilt, I think, adds that dimension as well that is sorely needed on this team, which is rebounding and a little bit of defensive acumen. As Juancho Hernan-Gomez comes back here from COVID protocols, I think how that rotation plays out at the 4 spot, which is what I'm writing about for Thursday's paper, Wednesday's paper. What day is it? I don't even know.
Yeah, don't worry about
it. How that plays out at the 4 spot is going to be one of the more intriguing things to watch here over the next few games. And Jalen Noel is starting to gain some confidence. And I think when the Wolves drafted him last year, you could look at his stats coming out of Washington, Pac-12 Player of the Year. Seemed like he could really light it up. And I think you're seeing him get some more confidence in his shot as well. Naz Reid, another guy who just keeps, I think, generally ascending, but with Towns coming back, his minutes are going to go down as he kind of gets relegated to the backup 5 role. But I think with those young guys, maybe pushing some of these slightly older guys, the Okogis, the Culvers, the Jake Laymans of the world, and Juancho, these guys are pushing at these guys' heels for playing time. And when they've been given the opportunity, they've been producing. And Ryan Saunders said as much last night that, these guys playing well puts everybody on notice. So we'll see how it plays out as they get some of these guys back here.
I'm glad you mentioned Towns. I mean, that's kind of anytime you talk about a 5-15 start, you have to talk about Towns has only played 4 games. Both the wrist injury early and then being in COVID protocols for, the better part of more than 2 weeks now. That said, I don't think each and every one of their problems can only be attributed to him being gone. So where do you find that sweet spot between their last in the NBA in offensive efficiency and Karl-Anthony Towns' absence explains a lot? Like, how much of their problem does he solve immediately when he's back and kind of has his wind?
A significant portion of it, but I don't think this team magically transforms into a contender just because he's taking the floor on a regular basis. Now we don't have any real hard info on what this team looks like, because it's like you said, it's only been 4 games. But yeah, I think what's struck at the heart of disappointment this year was, I don't think people expected them to lose or to win most of their games while Towns was out. But I think you've seen enough games now, 16 games, where he hasn't played. And most of those games, it was hard to see anything that was going right. It was hard to see where progress was being made. Hard to see a bright spot that gave you hope that when Towns comes back into this lineup, that it's suddenly going to be better. And I think that's where the real depression sets in when you think about the Wolves this season, was that it was hard to see where this team was getting better around Towns. The Cleveland games were a little better, but Cleveland's not exactly, a high caliber opponent. They're decent, but they're not great. So I think, especially offensively, that, like you said, last in efficiency is definitely a warning sign for that things may not be completely right here. And it's something that they're well aware of and that they, are trying to fix.
And we, when, like you said, we can't make too much of a judgment until he comes back and we see he and D'Angelo Russell at least play a bunch of games consecutively together, get into a rhythm. But it does, I do still have questions about how Russell in particular fits into all this, because he seems like he wants to play sometimes differently than they want to play, and not a detriment to him necessarily. That's that's who he is. He's become a very good player in this league a certain way. Maybe that can leave you with that question. How do they kind of square that notion of what they want from Russell and how much more can he give them within the system that they want to play?
I think you're going to see that play out when he and Towns start running the pick and roll together, because I think that is ultimately the dynamic that they brought Russell in here for. It's not necessarily to push the pace or get out in transition, and there is an element of that they want in the offense, but most of your offense is going to come in half court sets. It's not going to come in transition. And so having Russell and Towns operate that pick and roll with Malik Beasley waiting in the corner for an open three is kind of what they have envisioned for 30 plus minutes a night. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to stop. We saw it in those first 2 games of the season, especially out in Utah, that was a pretty effective way to run an NBA offense around those guys. And so I think Towns being out there also frees up, guys like Josh Okogie who might thrive cutting off of what Karl is able to generate. Maybe a guy like Jake Layman as well, or it maybe allows you to play a more defensive-minded lineup like a Okogie or a Jared Vanderbilt when you have the offensive weapons that you do. So I think as it relates to Russell, I think that is the dynamic you're looking at, is half court pick and roll, him and Karl. How can they feed off of each other and create for their teammates out of those sets?
Good stuff, Chris. Good catching up. Good talking about the Wolves as always. Follow Chris at Christopher Hine. Is that right?
Yes,
I thought
yes.
so.
At Chris Hine was taken 12 years ago when I created a Twitter account.
Wow.
So I went with the full version. Someone beat me to it.
An even earlier adopter. Wow. Okay. So at Christopher Hine, read all this stuff on Star Tribune, StarTribune.com. Chris, thanks so much, and we'll see how this looks when hopefully Towns is back in the lineup soon. So definitely some positives to look for as you follow the rest of this Wolves season. I should note, though, Karl Anthony Towns out for Wednesday night's game at San Antonio. He is on the road trip, but not ready yet to return from COVID protocols. I would imagine they will see him back soon, but not on Wednesday night anyway. I have a special treat for everyone today, a little segment I call Have You Ever Been More Angry? One of my longest standing internet friends was kind enough to join me. You might know him as Chiken Fingerz on Twitter. Before an unfortunate Twitter misunderstanding about Eagles fans, you might have known him as Clarence Swamptown. You possibly listened to him on the Sportive podcast when he is able to make it. With that lengthy introduction out of the way, we are here to discuss one thing, Chiken Fingerz: Kevin Fiala's 3-game boarding suspension, which will finally be lifted Thursday when the Wild plays again against Colorado. Chiken Fingerz has done a fair amount of internet-based research and is here armed with facts. But before we get to that, I must ask, Chiken Fingerz, have you ever been more angry?
Well, thank you, Michael. I know I've said it a lot in the past, but this time I'm serious. This time I have never been more angry. I'm being serious now.
Okay, so why what explains your particular anger at the Kevin Fiala 3-game boarding suspension?
Sure, let's start there. I think everybody looked at the 3-game suspension and kind of did the shrug a guy emoji thing. I am not one to simply take the league at face value whenever I see anything. I always try to scratch into it just a little bit to see Does it all hold water? 3 games to me just didn't quite pass my initial sniff test.
Uh-huh.
So I looked back at the list of suspensions. Now, again, I want to preface this by saying I believe the hit deserved a suspension.
Yeah, it was
What
a bad
struck
hit.
me, yeah, it certainly was, and especially in a season that only it's a 56 game season this year in the NHL. 3 games it isn't comparable to 3 games in the past. Obviously,
It's like 4 or 5 in an 82 game season, is it not?
absolutely, yeah. I'm not a mathematician. You are.
I
I'm
could
not.
do it quick on my calculator, but we'll go on.
But so it just struck me as too much. So I looked back at I just looked at the last 3 years. I stopped there. There's suspensions for illegal hits to the head, elbowing, cross-checking. There's suspensions for spitting. There's suspensions for hitting a ref. There's all kinds of different suspensions out there, but I just tried to focus on boarding. So here are the numbers that I found for the last 3 seasons. Last year, 2019, 2020 season, that was also a COVID shortened season, 68 games, I want to say is what it was. The boarding suspensions were 1 game, 2 games, and 2 games.
Those were three different suspensions for boarding, 1, 2, and 2. Got it.
Exactly. Season before was a full 82 game season.
Mm-hmm.
There were 4 boarding suspensions, all of which were 1 game.
Wow.
Season before that, 2017, 2018, full 82 game season.
Yes.
There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 boarding suspensions.
Yes.
They were 2 games, 1 game, 1 game, 2, 2. And then the last 2 were a 3 game suspension and a 4 game suspension. All right, let's dig a little deeper into those. The first one was Nazem Kadri. We saw him tonight. At the time, he was playing for Toronto. Now he plays for Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, he had already been suspended, I believe, 3 or 4 times before that. So he was a multiple offender, is what they called him. That was the reason for his 3 game suspension. The 4 game suspension was for Tom Wilson, known multiple offender. 4 games for him because he gets suspended about once a month, basically.
Yeah.
Kevin Fiala, never been suspended previously.
No, first time offender.
And you look at the NHL videos that they post and the player safety.
Yeah, I watched that one.
And they give the explanation. It all sounds very professional. And all of the other videos, any boarding suspension is going to be pretty graphic. They all look about the same. Nothing about Fiala's stood out. The guy, he got his foot caught in with the guy's right skate. It was unfortunate. Then he did the pushing motion, which that's the reason why he got suspended.
Yeah.
End of the day, it looked like every other video for boarding. The only differentiation was that it's a 3 game suspension. The rest of them are 1.
That's interesting. And do you think, so the Wild loses the first game at the suspension 5-1. Okay, that's a game that, you logically would say Fiala's going to miss that game at least. Mm-hmm. They managed to win the second game 4-3 without him in overtime against, again, Colorado. So you're thinking probably maximum at that point, that should be the end of his suspension if we're kind of going by history, at least, for a first-time offender at the very least. And then you get to the Tuesday night game, they lose 2-1. Do you think it would have been useful to have Kevin Fiala in a 2-1 loss to a division rival, Chiken Fingerz?
Your best offensive player may have been valuable. Now, maybe Kaprizov someday will be their best. He's not quite there yet.
He had a goal. He did have their goal. Their one goal.
He did have their goal. But I think Kevin Fiala is still inarguably, he's still your best offensive weapon. In a 2-1 game on a team that's desperate for any type of offense. I think, he would have provided some value. People can make up their own minds on whether they should be angry or they should just be shrug a guy emoji and not worry about it.
Awesome. Well, this is good stuff. I was entertained, but I also learned something, and I hope everybody else did too. Chiken Fingerz, appreciate it. We will do this again soon. Well, now it's time for the tables to turn a little bit, isn't it? It's you asking me a question, a little segment I call Infrequently Asked Questions. Today, it comes from Lob Wedge Guy. Interesting thought here. He says, would it be bad for one of the men's teams in Minnesota to finally win a title in the near future? kind of feels like the inability to do so is more important to the narrative than actually winning one, like a dog chasing a car, etc. Parentheses later in the tweet, I would prefer to win something for what it's worth. I kind of get this, but two things about it, as they bother me is the wrong word, but that I got to take issue with a little bit. One, I don't like how we separate this into the men's and the women's pile, because the Lynx won 4 championships in the last 10 years. I know some people don't consider them the same way that they do some of the other teams in town for whatever unfortunate reasons those might be, but the Lynx have won. So the championship drought, if you're counting major sports, which I consider major sports being the top professional league in this market, where the players are at least able to make a living, which the WNBA has. They have a way to go, but you can make a living in the WNBA at the very least. They have won, so this isn't a championship drought per se, but yes, it is a men's championship drought. No team has won a men's championship in almost 30 years now, since the Twins won one in 1991. Do I think that's part of the narrative, that people would suffer in some way if the Twins suddenly were able to win? Twins or Vikings or Wolves, Wild, I don't think so. I do think they went through this a little bit in Boston, when there was the big Red Sox drought from 1918 until 2004, and then they finally won. The Red Sox fans were like, well, now what do we do? Well, you know what you do? You keep winning. You want to win more. You don't stop wanting to win championships just because you won one. I think it'd be good for the collective psyche of everybody here to win another championship, regardless of whether it's a leather Lynx title or if it's a men's championship this time around. We're going to end the day with the cooler. We started the day with the Twin story. We're going to finish the day with the Twin story. This one far more important than Nelson Cruz even signing a 1-year contract. This report from the Orange County Register, new Twins shortstop Andrelton Simmons went through a real hard time in 2020, mental and emotional struggle amid the coronavirus pandemic, to the point that he was thinking about suicide. So serious. I'm so glad that he opened up to that newspaper. Did not make mention of this in his introductory news conference with the Twins a couple of days ago, but was able to finally tell his story now. And said, the thought of going into the bubble last year, remember how the teams were going to go into a bubble in the last week of the season? He couldn't do it, so he opted out of that part of it. The pandemic took such a toll on him, and I'm sure so many other people, athletes included. But he was able to find his voice and tell his story. A quote from that story: "Now seeing how more and more people are struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicide, I felt it might be time to share a little piece of my story. I was afraid of people judging and people twisting my story. Let's make sure we do not do that we understand how important this story is, how this is becoming part of a larger trend of athletes sharing similar stories. And I sincerely hope this helps Simmons just as much as it helps everybody else who will read it." That'll do it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to the Star Tribune, startribune.com, and we will see you again Thursday.